Welcome to our podcast. My name is Oli McCann, Employment Partner at After Athena. Today we're going to talk about the tricky and emotive issue of equal pay in the workplace and why you have been probably hearing a lot of this in the local media and in the national media, and what this may well mean for employers moving forwards. One of the reasons you will have heard more about this topic is because equal pay has made the headlines in the news over the last 2 years, with cases involving two giant retailers, Next and Asda, to name but two, and also the news that Birmingham City Council declaring itself bankrupt primarily due to a massive equal pay liability estimated to be somewhere between 650 million and 760 million. Pretty scary stuff. The headlines are naturally concerning for employers, and it is a subject that will continue to create headlines over the next few years. And bigger risk is that we're likely to see an increased litigation in this area, given the publicity that these two cases have been attracting, with greater scrutiny over what is happening within the workplace in terms of pay. So today, as we discuss this topic, I'm joined by my colleague Natalie Parkinson, a Senior Associate Solicitor and Head of Employment Litigation at After Athena. Welcome, Natalie.
Hi.
Are you ready to have a good discussion around equal pay?
Ready to go.
Well, perhaps the starting point should be for us to understand, what we mean by equal pay. What is the legal position regarding the equal pay?
It's the basic concept when we're talking about equal pay and equal pay legislation is that men and women should be paid equally for doing equal work, and that's when working for the same employer or an associated employer. It's different to gender pay gap reporting, and I think that's often confused. When we talk about gender pay gap reporting, we're looking at a measure to show the difference in average earnings between men and women in the workplace. And that typically highlights less opportunity or paths for women to progress. It is important though, because employers often can use that as a prompt to identify issues. And where you hear about a big gender pay gap, it can sometimes cause an employer to reflect. But again, it's different. They're not the same thing. It's not about fair pay either. So you can have two individuals in the same role, but they're the same sex and they're paid differently. They wouldn't have an equal pay claim because you've got two men or two women that are paid differently. And I think those alleged equal pay claims, they might also have allegations or claims of sex discrimination. But when we talk about equal pay claim generally, we're talking about an implied term in the contract of employment that men and women are to be paid equally. And for those that love legislation, that's at Section 66 of the Equality Act. You can Google it. I'm right, I've checked. Equal pay claims, they're broken down into three categories. So when we talk about claims that are brought within an employment tribunal, that's what we're looking at, three categories of claims. So like work, and that's the same or very similar tasks. So if you think about, two bus drivers, one's male, one's female, they're paid differently. Is that fair? Is it not fair? And have we got an equal pay claim there? Work rated as equivalent. So that's where the work has been assessed by a job evaluation as equivalent, and then there's a claim there. Or work of equal value. Now, this third category is the one that's particularly interesting and the one that's really been catching attention in the headlines. And that's where you have different work, but it's viewed as equal in terms of effort, skill, and value. So again, that's the category that really has been hitting the press in recent years. I know that obviously you and I, we've had several instances of this recently. We've been dealing with this from our employer clients.
Yeah.
And it's really that issue that's been grabbing attention.
So just in terms of the sort of equal value position, just so we're clear, are we saying that, I don't know, a head of HR can compare themselves with head of finance, for example?
Yes, it's exactly that scenario, really. You have two roles which you might view as fundamentally different, but the individual that's in that role finds out there's a pay disparity, and then they're looking to highlight or allege that there's an equal pay issue there. So that's not to say there's not a defence, but there's been a highlighted difference that an individual's picked up on, and then they're bringing an equal pay claim. Now, for an employer, it is pretty scary because you might just think, well, these are two separate people doing two separate jobs, and therefore that's fine. They're paid differently. That's okay. But where the challenge comes in is where that individual is alleging, well, actually, whilst yes, we have a different job title, yes, we're in different teams, yes, we're in different areas of the business, but what we are doing is the same in terms of the contribution that we're making, in terms of the skill set that we've got, and that's where the equal pay angle comes in.
Yeah, it's going to be pretty scary for
It
employers because I
is,
think most employers would think it's like for like
yeah,
rather than sort of being able to compare yourselves across two completely different roles,
yeah,
probably with different pressures, different responsibilities, etc. So it's
absolutely,
yeah. So if there is a sort of an argument that work is of equal value, and let's assume a court concludes that the work is of equal value, does an employer have a defence to that?
they do, and I think this is really important for an employer to understand. There are several stages to an equal pay claim. So the first step is that obviously the employee is alleging there's an equal pay issue. Well, is that right? Is there a pay difference? That's the first thing. If there is, well, what's the employer's response to that? And if we're talking about a response, if we're talking about a defence, an employer might be able to say there's a material factor. What is the reason why that person is paid differently to the counterpart that they've raised or that they've brought up? That might be something like, for example, market forces. There might be geographical differences. So, if, for example, you've got somebody working in London and based in London, and they're comparing themselves to somebody that's based in Manchester, there might be reasons for that. So it's not to say that because there's a pay difference, there isn't a response or a defence, but it's about what is that defence and how can the employer evidence it.
So we're down to the employer to really understand why that pay differential exists, try
Yeah,
to explain it to the court, to try and demonstrate one of these material factor
that's
defences.
right. Yeah.
Right. Okay. Interesting. So it might be helpful for us just to have a look at in a bit more detail in the two cases we've just referenced. So, just in relation to the Next and Asda cases, do you want to just tell us a little bit more about what those cases maybe tell us as an employer and what our clients can learn from that?
Yeah, so if we firstly look at Next, because that's been the one that really has been in the headlines most recently, I would say. So Next are facing a potential £30 million compensation payout to retail store employees, that's customer service assistants, who argued that they were unfairly paid less than their warehouse and logistics counterparts. We're talking about around 3,500 claimants that are involved in that action. And it's a landmark case, really. It's the first time that a group equal pay action of this type anyway had succeeded in the private sector. Again, we're talking about 3,500 claimants, and they have successfully been able to demonstrate that the work they are doing is of equal value. So that third category of claim that we were
Mm.
talking about earlier, despite being in different roles and paid differently. So, as we were saying sort of before, you've got people that are doing different jobs, different teams, different departments, but they're alleging that there's an equal pay issue. And in this case, in this instance, they've fallen down. It's what we call a first instance decision. So, it's at employment tribunal stage just now. And Next has indicated that they're going to appeal that judgment. So, the reasons for the appeal, obviously, we'll see. Um, it's been very much based on expert evidence, and the experts have rated various components of the job of the retail staff against the warehouse and logistics counterparts. They've scored them, and they've said that that work is of equal value. That's going to be difficult for Next to appeal. I
Mm.
think that's going to be a challenge for them. So I think any appeal that's mounted and that will follow will be related to their defence, so that material factor. Think, really interestingly for Next and why that defence has fallen down, they have been found in terms of their material factor to have brought one or to have raised one that's tainted by sex. And obviously, that's not gonna wash. So
No.
be interested and one to
Yeah.
watch out for in
I
terms of the
think my
grounds of
my
appeal.
understanding on that that material factor defence is that they have argued that they were reliant on market forces,
That's right.
on the labour market, and basically saying that the labour market for hiring people in warehouse and logistics set rates at a higher rate of pay than what the labour market was for people working as customer service assistants or retail assistants in the stores. And I think from recollection that the tribunal concluded that those two markets were significantly different, but based on sex.
That's
The
right.
warehouse and logistics market, labour market, being predominantly male,
Mhm.
90% nearly, and vice versa. The retail and customer service assistants in retail stores being primarily women,
Yeah.
but also part-time women. And as a result, I think they were concluding that the rate of pay for women was like suppressed because more women were just keen to get part-time
Yeah.
work, which meant that there wasn't as much of a push to drive the
Mm.
rate of pay up. Whereas in warehouse and logistics, whereas men fighting for the same jobs, it pushes the rate of pay up. That was my understanding of why that
Yeah.
material factor defence failed. It was the sex difference between the two markets that were being compared.
Yeah. And it's interesting, I think, because essentially there you've got a scenario where there's an equal pay issue, and then the defence to that falls down again because of a sex issue in that the labour market is tainted. And you're absolutely right. I think they found sort of 90% of the warehouse and logistics market was sort of centred around males and male applicants. So it's interesting because the defence that they've brought might be right in terms of, yes, it was a harder market to recruit into, which has driven up pay. But then the reason for that is because, it's tainted by sex because the labour market is predominantly male. So yeah, really
Yeah, it
interesting.
is. It'll be interesting to see how that pans out
Yeah.
in the appeal courts because really that is no one's fault. That is
No?
just parts and parcel of society in the
Yeah.
way sort of men might lean towards those more manual jobs, whereas as females may well lean towards retail jobs in society currently, and that's resulted in the differential really, and that's not Next's
Next
fault
fault.
or
Yeah.
indeed Asda's fault if they get to that
Yeah.
similar situation in due course. So
Yeah.
it's going to be interesting to see whether that appeal is successful because I can see that many people look at it and say, well, that's unfair. They're
Yeah.
just simply paying the market rate relevant to that market.
Yeah.
Interesting. And what's is there anything different in terms of the Asda case? Is it quite similar?
Yeah, it is similar in terms of, again, we're talking about that third category of claims. It's bigger, it's much bigger. So Asda versus Next, I suppose, minor £30 million are facing a potential £1.2 billion
Significant.
payout if their claim falls down. So it's similar circumstances. So in that case, you've got female retail workers arguing they're paid less than, again, their male counterparts in warehouse in the distribution centres. It involves more than 60,000 workers and it's been ongoing since 2014. So it's a long runner and it keeps going through obviously various hurdles, but it is now in its final stages. The most recent decision in January of this year was that the work of those two roles was of equal value. So again, they're in that same position as Next were. So now we're looking at their defences. So the next case, I think, will have really set some hairs running amongst the ASDA legal team. And they will perhaps be keeping a really close eye on that decision to think about how their defence has been framed and where their risk areas sit.
Yeah, so they're facing some significant risk and
Yeah,
will be extremely worried, won't they?
yeah.
Yeah. And just in relation to, I mean, I remember sort of this Asda case has gone through the courts for many years, as you say, with preliminary issues being raised and
Hmm.
quite tricky, complex issues, which we won't get into the details today. But I remember looking back, sort of 2015, 2016, as this case is progressing, thinking there's no way, the women in the retail customer service assistant roles are going to be able to say that the work is of equal value to those in the logistics because the roles are so different. So it's really interesting to see how experts have been used in these cases to
Hmm.
evaluate the job of each category and come to the conclusion that the retail customer service assistants are actually there's more demand and pressure on them than there are on people in the warehouse and logistics department. It's fascinating.
Yeah, it is fascinating. And I think, going back to what we were saying at the beginning, it's talking about the contribution almost, that work being of equal value. They're saying, yeah, it's different, but what we contribute in terms of skill, in terms of decision making, it's at that same level. And, it is interesting if you ever look at any of these assessments, it's interesting to look at how these matters are broken down and I suppose the level of thought that's applied to it and how those are sort of transferred across and played through. And I think for employers particularly, it's concerning because really you don't know where that allegation is going to come from. If you think about, a traditional equal pay claim, as we're sort of saying, two people that do that same job in that same team, they're both, bus drivers, as I was saying before, they're both teachers, they're of those various roles. you can easily look at that and say, well, yeah, we've got two bus drivers and this is why they are paid the levels of pay that they
Mm,
are. You can't forecast these claims and you don't know where they're going to come from. So yeah, it's scary. And it is concerning, I suppose, for employees and particularly those big retailers. They're really going to be
yeah.
concerned about this.
So it's an interesting point that because I mean I've been doing employment law for 25 years now, and it's only really in the last 5 or 6 years that I've had to deal with equal pay claims, which
Yep.
probably shows the level of publicity some of these equal pay cases are getting now. But also traditionally, equal pay cases were predominantly seen in the local like local government sector.
Mhm.
So where there's heavily unionised, comparing people's
Mhm.
jobs. Whether it's councils or
Yeah.
sort of schools comparing themselves, caretakers comparing themselves with dinner ladies and
Yeah.
etc. Whereas now we're seeing it more in the private sector, and obviously the ASDA and the next
Mhm.
case are the big ones in the private sector. And what we're seeing, and certainly the cases that we've worked on together, Natalie, are employees who tend to be bringing claims for equal pay when they've fallen out with the employer.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So it's either they've got a grievance about something, or they've been made redundant or dismissed, and they think, well, hang on, I've never really been happy about the pay difference between myself and someone I view as equal, doing equal work. And so I'm going to throw that into the mix.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think really interestingly, they seem to follow or fall on the back of an employee finding out about somebody's pay and then feeling really aggrieved about that. So they see somebody else that they perhaps think doesn't work as hard as they do, and then find out there's a pay disparity and are really not happy about that. And then perhaps they've heard about some of these cases in the news where untraditionally, we're not talking about same job role, we're talking about different departments, but
Mm,
that same contribution. And they will look at that and go, well, actually, yeah, I think that my work is equivalent to that person. So if you think about, for example, a head of one team comparing themselves to a head of another team, we've also seen, sort of in the work that we do, people within the same team but different banding, perhaps,
yeah.
alleging that there is an unequal pay issue. So you've got maybe one male in a team of females, and they would allege that they're paid unequally. Well, some of the examples of the cases that we've worked on, you've got somebody really junior in that setting comparing themselves to somebody that's really senior, but they're alleging there's an equal pay issue. So then it falls to the employer to explain that. And on the face of it, you'll go, well, obviously you're not paid as much. You've been doing this for 2 years. That person's been doing it for
Yeah,
20 years.
experience.
Clearly, you would not be paid the same. But for an employer, you've got a sex difference, you've got a pay difference. So how are you going to explain that? And that's where,
Yeah,
that really falls to the employer then.
yeah, and I suppose that maybe highlights some of the naivety on some employees that bring these
Yeah.
claims, just think because they've got the same job title, it
Yeah.
entitles them to the same pay without really taking into consideration the significant difference that might
Yeah.
exist in terms of experience, knowledge, technical ability, etc. Yeah, yeah,
Absolutely.
very interesting. And sort of in terms of obviously, employers will be concerned now about that ability for employees to compare themselves with people in different roles, not just like for like, etc. So, what can employers start doing now to protect themselves or mitigate the risk of equal pay claims moving forwards?
I think there are sort of a few strands to this, really. And you can look at it almost with two hats. So, day to day, what can you do practically? And if this were to end up in a claim, in an ideal world, what would you have to be able to defend your position? So, there's two strands to it, really. And I think certainly with my role with my employment tribunal hat on, I always look at these with the benefit of hindsight and I go, wouldn't it be great if we had? So, I'm thinking of it with that hat on, wouldn't it be great if we had? If you're making pay decisions, when you're making pay decisions, how were they made? Where often we find it challenging is where somebody will come to us with a grievance, and I think you would agree, of there's a pay issue, and we will ask the question of our client, well, what is the reason? Why is there a pay difference? And sometimes they don't really have an answer. They know it's not due to sex, but when we sort of ask them and put it to them, what is the difference? They don't really
Yeah,
necessarily sometimes have the evidence or the grounds to back that up. So things like review how you set pay. How do you set pay? How are pay decisions made? If you've got a loan manager that's making these decisions off on their own, and are setting pay, that's often tricky because then when that manager leaves or moves on, you're sort of having to explain something that somebody else has made without you really being in the loop. So having things like a pay committee in place can help. Any moderation as well in terms of pay. So if you have a pay committee that are making decisions together, you can look at that and think, actually, what is the salary that's appropriate for that role? Why is that salary being set at that level? And is that consistent? Is that consistent across the board for the workforce that we've got? Um, I think, anything of that nature will help. And, for a smaller organisation, that might not be feasible. That might not really, be something that they can
Mm.
put in place. But what you can do is have your decision moderated or second checked by even just one other person. It just shows that you've not got sort of one person, and potentially then you've got two people that can evidence or explain why you've made a decision that you've made. The other thing that you could look at doing is putting in place a job evaluation scheme where you actually have your jobs assessed in terms of pay. That can be costly though, so I think that's a really big decision for an employer to make.
And presumably, if an employer does that, that might actually throw up
Yeah.
anomalies, which then might be disclosable to
Yeah,
employees,
exactly.
where you can't hide. And if it throws up an anomaly, then that might actually be a sort of a prompt for the employees to think, well,
Yeah,
actually, that means I've been
unfairly treated. Yeah.
unfairly paid for the last 6 years, which
Yeah.
is the amount of time they
And
can go
start
back and claim.
claims.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's tricky. It's a difficult one. I think, as always, with employment and with an employer, consistency is key. So, making sure that we're treating our employees fairly and being consistent. So, are we, for example, carrying out annual pay reviews? And if so, how is that carried out? What I often see when a client will come to me is that maybe they've got different teams and different managers. One team will carry out pay reviews in one way, and another team might carry them out differently. Well, if you're talking about that third category of claims where people are alleging work of equal value and you've got different managers making different decisions, that then becomes difficult. So consistency, I would say, is key. Would
Yeah.
you agree with that?
Yeah, I probably haven't that, as you say, that overarching
Yeah,
view, someone who can look at the organization as a whole, look at the structure, look at who's in what teams and departments, and where they sit in the structure, and decide whether or not there's a pay disparities that need addressing. And I
yeah,
suppose the best time to do that, certainly for larger employers that have to submit gender pay gap reports,
hmm,
is probably to do your audit on an annual basis when you're
yeah,
doing that,
absolutely.
really.
Yeah,
And sometimes it requires a bit of a line by line assessment as well.
yeah.
Um,
I think the other thing that can help is having up to date and accurate job descriptions and job titles. So consider, is the job title that an individual has really appropriate for the role that they're doing? And is their job description accurate? If we're talking about being able to sort of evidence some of these things, that will always be helpful.
Yeah, it's interesting that I've got a case that we were successful at the tribunal as an employer defending a claim for equal pay based on the employee's claim that went back 6 years plus with lots of different job descriptions. But some job descriptions weren't up to date at the time. Some job descriptions didn't actually exist at the particular point in time that they changed the role or had a change in title. And it became very difficult to try to explain that. We were very reliant on witness evidence
Hmm.
to be able to explain the position. And we were fortunate enough that we had witnesses available to do that. But if
Yeah,
those witnesses have moved on, as an
yeah.
employer, you're scuppered.
Scuppered, yeah, absolutely. I think the other thing, a key bit of advice really is to deal with allegations and deal with issues as and when they arise. If somebody is to come to you and say that they think there's a pay issue, let's look at it, let's deal with it. Don't ignore it. If you brush it under the carpet and wait for them to go off and issue a claim, you're just sort of kicking the can into the long grass and, potentially causing yourself a headache for later down the line. Try and get ahead of it and, really get ahead of that issue
Yeah,
rather than waiting for it,
yeah.
and investigate what are the reasons, what's the issue, and can we explain any pay differential to an employee? Is there even a pay differential? They might think there is, but there might not be. That's another factor. So it's important really to take all of this sort of in the round, and take legal advice
Yeah,
when that grievance comes to you. Don't try and bodge it and deal with it yourself. These are serious, and potential payouts, as we've highlighted, can be significant,
yeah,
particularly when, as well, you're teaming up not just the equal pay liability, but if there's an accompanying sex discrimination claim as well, you're talking obviously not just about financial cost, it's reputational damage as well.
yeah,
That's the other big thing that really
yeah.
employers need to be
It,
aware
it's
of.
a valid point, and certainly I know I've advised a few clients who have had grievances around unfair pay or unequal pay, whatever you want to call it at the time, and we help the employer make sure that that grievance outcome and the appeal outcome was as robust as possible and aligned perfectly with their potential future legal defence to the
Yeah.
claim, because ultimately, when that grievance is raised and the employer responds to it, that will become
Yeah.
documentary evidence that is disclosable in the tribunal proceedings.
Hmm.
So if you're running a different argument in the tribunal to what you said in your grievance outcome, there's an immediate
Not great
question. Yeah,
credibility.
yeah, absolutely. So getting the lawyers involved, and I would
Yeah.
say that because we are a lawyer, but
Yeah.
getting the lawyers involved
Yeah.
early on in those kind of matters is really
Yeah.
important, because
Absolutely.
you've got to try to deter the claim from occurring. But if it occurs, you need to put yourself in your best possible position to run a
Hmm.
consistent line of defence, really.
Yeah. And I think really that ties into my next bit of advice, which is something that I will always say with my tribunal hat on for any issue that an employer comes to me to, but document everything. And, think about that right from the early doors when you're talking about, why is pay being set at a particular level? If you're talking about, a tricky labour market where you've not been able to recruit, so you've had to up the salary perhaps that you first offered, can you prove that? Can you show that? If you've advertised for a role at a certain salary, you've not got any attention, and then you've had to up that salary offer. Can we show that? If somebody's really heavily negotiated that salary and we've brought them in, can we evidence or
Yeah,
show that? Because all of that will be helpful in terms of documentary evidence to prove why we've done things in a particular way. When we've done pay reviews, if you do decide to go down the route of having a pay committee, do we have minutes of those meetings? Can we show that that pay has been moderated? Why has it been set at that level? Any documents that we've got will be helpful, hopefully, when
yeah,
we get to the tribunal, or not, and then there's an issue. But either
yeah,
way, you would still need to deal
yeah,
with it. So
yeah.
yeah,
I mean, as lawyers, we love our documents to be able to
yeah,
defend a claim, and they're the best form of defence, really,
yeah,
because it documents what happened at that point in time rather than witness recollection.
absolutely,
And I suppose that's down to employers to maybe put in place systems and processes to capture pay decisions, whether it's at
absolutely, yeah,
recruitment or on the annual reviews,
yeah,
or those that happen in between because someone's threatening to leave and you decided, oh, panic, I'm going to increase the pay.
yeah,
Well, we need to document what happened and why that happened and why we're prepared to
yeah.
increase the pay, as opposed to maybe letting them leave and maybe recruit from the open labour market.
Yeah, and I think finally what I would say is on sort of what they need to be aware of, what they could do to mitigate risks, etc. It is really just to be alive to the fact that this might come, or the claim or the allegation might come from a non-traditional setting. So where we're talking in the next and the ASDA cases around retail staff versus warehousing and logistics, it's being alive to the fact that that is an issue and it
Yeah,
might be something that we have to deal with.
yeah, yeah. And just out of interest, I'm sure some people will be thinking, well, can an employee actually ask another employee what salary they're on? Is that legal?
Yeah, you can ask.
Yeah,
Yeah.
no breach of confidentiality or anything like that.
I suppose it's for the employee to decide whether they're willing or prepared to disclose
Mm,
that information. And you need to be careful because what you don't want to do is to say to an employee within the workplace that you can't share this information. I think that can be tricky
yeah,
because
yeah.
then, why? What's the reason? What are you hiding?
Yeah, no, I mean, you're right. But I think the reality is that certainly feedback we're getting from employees is that sort of the younger generations coming through are more open around pay and
Yeah,
talk about pay on a regular basis, and so even more reason for employers to really make sure that they're reviewing and auditing their pay
yeah,
approach and trying to get it as fair as possible and aligned on an equal value basis, really, or like for like work,
yeah.
etc. So just what's the future for equal pay then?
I think for me, we're at a really interesting point of time. And when you look at sort of the litigious landscape and what we're looking at with the next case, the ASDA case and equal pay legislation more recently, actually we're kind of back to where we started. If you go right back to the roots, the foundations of equal pay legislation and claims, if you look at, the Ford factory and the strikes that were there in Dagenham, that was about women that were classed as unskilled saying, hang on a minute, we don't think this is fair. The men in the factory are classed as skilled and we think the work that we're doing is skilled. We're kind of back there.
Yeah,
So whilst we're talking about the future of equal pay, we're also talking about the history and how we're in the same position. So I think for me, as a bit of a history buff, it is a really interesting point in time that we're at because we've almost come full circle. I think the fact that all of this is in the news, the fact that all of this is in the press, it sparks ideas in employees. So I think that employers might find that the fact that this is being talked about sparks employees to sit there and think, hmm, actually, maybe I'm not happy. And I found out that Jim that sits in accounts is paid differently to me. But I think what I do is, of equal value to that person. So I'm going to challenge it and I'm going to raise it. So I think that's something that employers need
Yeah.
to be aware of, that these issues are going to be litigated more frequently. I think, you mentioned the fact that in recent years you've seen more of this than ever
Mm,
before. In terms of my background, I used to deal with an Act for claimants in discrimination matters. In that time, I didn't deal with an equal pay claim, an equal pay allegation. Whereas now we've seen them, we're
we
dealing
have,
with them,
yeah.
we have them now, we've got them running, they're live. So I think that's certainly something to be aware of. The other interesting angle to this, when we're talking about the future, is the Labour government. And they're talking about, they're looking at extending equal pay legislation, not only to cover gender and sex, but also to cover race and disability. That's going to be really, really interesting in terms of how that plays out, and whether that opens up a whole new litigious
Yeah.
field almost. Yeah.
Yeah, and you can understand why. I think the statistics do show that
Yeah.
people from ethnic minorities or with disabilities tend to be paid less than
Yeah.
their sort of
Yeah.
counterparts, who are white British or non-disabled, for example.
Hmm.
So it's no surprise that that's on the agenda,
Yeah.
and I do think that that's likely to
Agree.
make it
Yeah.
way through to legislation in
Hmm.
due course, and that will be another reason for employers to get ahead of the game
That's right.
and try to reduce the pay differentials across
Yeah.
their workforce where
Yeah.
it's like for like work
Yeah.
or work of equal value.
So I think my key message really to an employer that might be worried about this or concerned about this would be to look at how you are setting your pay decisions. And if perhaps maybe you've been a bit lax in the past, or you have had this scenario where, you're relying on managers of teams just to set the pay that they consider to be appropriate for the role that they're recruiting for, let's look at that. Let's look at how we make those pay decisions. Are you happy? Are you comfortable that that pay is right, that it's set in a fair way? And if not, what can we do to change that? Consider bringing in a pay committee. Consider thinking about that. If you're a smaller employer, look at having that decision moderated, or look at, making a decision in conjunction with somebody else that, again, perhaps we've got some documents to back up. Um, Anything that we can do to take those steps now will help you in the future. And if you're concerned about that, if you're not sure how to go about doing that, speak to somebody, speak to us, we can help.
That's great. Thank you very much, Natalie. Well, I'm sure you'll all agree this is quite a fascinating topic, but also quite scary, I'd imagine, if you're an employer. Appreciate you joining today and taking us through sort of the basics of equal pay and particularly the next and ASDA case, which is, yeah, a bit of an eye opener, I think, for employers. I think the big points for us to take away today really is that this topic isn't going to go away.
Nope.
It's here to stay, and if anything, it's going to grow. And more importantly, it's crucial to ensure that your pay structure is free from sex bias and why not at the same time free from any other kind of bias
Yeah.
in terms of sex, race, disability, etc. And that any differentials in pay is addressed sooner rather than later behind the scenes so that you mitigate the risk moving forwards. So if you would like to find out more on how we can support you here at Afro Athena, by all means reach out to us. But otherwise, thank you for listening and watching.